Righteousness of God. And I want to say a little bit about it, but before we go into the Abraham story, last week I talked a little bit about, we've talked about this phrase, and I talked a little bit about how we present the gospel to different people. And I spent a good part of the front end of the class on that. Because you present the gospel differently to different people at different times. And it depends on who you're dealing with and where they're at. And I know there's been seasons in my own life where I've wondered what does the gospel mean for me, where I am at in my present circumstance. And I think I compared the gospel a little bit to marriage, at least in the sense that when you commit yourself to it, you don't always know the depth of what you're committing yourself to. In the course of time, it becomes richer and richer and deeper and deeper. But today, before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about this phrase and go in a little bit of what I had in the lesson here, because Brother Doug pointed out after class that he's like shining his shirt, that I skipped through some of my very valuable notes in order to talk about what are the different ways we present the gospel to different people in different times? Very well and good. But of course we want to know, what does Paul do with this? So typically, if anybody ever taken a systematic theology course? You have. Yes, you have. Okay. They're going to distinguish between what they call the objective and the subjective part of salvation. The objective part is sort of what God does outside of you, and that is true. It's just a fact in the world. This is what God does. But the subjective part is, how does that come to apply to specific people? If I open a soup kitchen, the soup kitchen is there. But then the question, well, who comes to the soup kitchen? Who gets soup? And who exactly is a recipient of what it is that I'm providing? So that's a very, very important idea. Now, Paul has told us that the righteousness of God has its basis in the Torah and the prophets. If you read Genesis through Deuteronomy, they're filled with promises of what Yahweh will do for his people. And the prophets are the ones who say Yahweh will fulfill his promises in the course of time, particularly Isaiah, Jeremiah. We had the class in Ezekiel. So the righteousness of God in the objective sense means the righteousness that he has. He keeps his promises. He has promised that he will make Israel his holy people. He has promised that they will be a kingdom of priests. He has promised that he will bring in non-Israelites to the worship of the God of Jacob. And Paul is saying in the first instance, that has happened. Jesus has accomplished that. But you can also talk about the righteousness of God in a subjective sense. All right, well, who does that apply to and how does that happen? And that would be the righteousness that God gives to his people. And there's three words he uses in chapter 3 of Romans. And I want to talk a little bit about them because they become very important. The words are justification, redemption, and propitiation. We'll talk about the Greek words, and then Paul develops them, but he just rolls them out here in a few verses. And we've got to get a hold of them because for him, they are very, very important. Chapter 3, verse 23, he clusters them all in a single verse. He says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We've heard that verse. And then in verse 24, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ, And then the next verse, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. So we have two big ideas, which are grace, that's what God does, and then faith. That's what happens on our end. But then he uses these three different words, and I don't think that these are three different ways of putting the same thing. Each one seems to build upon the other to yield a whole picture. So on page 20 of the lesson here, I want to talk about justification. And I'll do the best I can. Some people have written whole books on justification. I mention here that this is a forensic term, and that means a legal term. So at the school where I teach, we do mock trial, and we pick a student to be guilty of some crime, and we hold a big trial. Forensic, the forum is the gateway of an ancient city, and that's where they would often hold their court trials. So we still use that term, forensic. Sometimes late at night I watch the Forensic Files. Anybody like the Forensic Files? Yeah, I like that, okay. It's back in the 80s and 90s. They used science to kind of solve cold cases and things and crimes. But that's what forensic means, is it's a legal courtroom definition. So in that sense, a person who is justified is pardoned by a judge. So a person has been formally accused of being guilty of something. The court process has run its course, and the judge delivers pardon. It's important that the guilty person has been acquitted even in advance of the last judgment. The tense of Paul's verb here is present passive participle, and that's a very technical way of saying, though, that we mentioned, I think, 2 weeks ago that the wrath of God is being revealed now as opposed to something that's going to happen at the end of time. And in the same way, we can say that this person has been pardoned by a judge now. That's a present experience. That is a very important area where Protestants and Catholics sometimes go different directions. Within the Roman Catholic thinking, you wait till the day of judgment to find out whether you've made it. Within the Protestant way of thinking, you know now that God has pardoned you. And it does lend a different temperament to the spirituality of each. Paul is not talking about sinlessness in the sense that we have attained moral perfection. We haven't attained moral perfection. But he is saying that we have been acquitted by God's free grace. And usually we use the word forgiveness for this, forgiveness of sin.
It'd be similar to Hunter Biden.
Yeah. That's not a bad recent example.
Not saying he's innocent. He's off the hook.
He is off the hook. He has been pardoned for anything that he has not yet even done. Now, that's an odd thing because I know you might think, well, geez, he could rob a bank now if he wanted to and still get a pardon. I don't know technically how that works. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a non-controversial thing that you just threw out there in the middle of class. Yeah, there's a name for it. It's a preemptory pardon.
But I mean, that would be similar, right?
It is. It's a preemptory pardon. We saw in Romans chapter 2 that Paul talks about the wrath of God, not just in terms of the end time, but as a present reality. And he uses that same language here, and Protestants have taken hold of this ever since the days of Luther to say that This is a big part of the gospel, that we may be assured now, not just at the end where we stand before God in judgment, but now God has pardoned us. And that is where the word justification comes in. Justitia, the Greek word, is very close to righteousness. And so the righteousness of God here not only refers to the righteousness God has, but it also refers to a kind of pardon that he gives to his people in a law court setting. And I think for most of us who've been grown up and worked in Protestant circles, that's a very, very big issue. I want to see if there's any questions or comments about that, because that's the first word that he uses. He's going to develop it as he moves throughout the book. Your sins are forgiven. Yeah.
Let's make a statement that this is great.
What's that?
This is great.
You like this?
This is fantastic.
Okay. I leapt over this the other day.
Gloss over that.
I glossed over it. What else could I say about it? I don't worry that when I come before the Lord in judgment, and I believe I will come before the Lord in judgment. I don't know what that'll look like. Won't be like last week, the week before, where I said they show some kind of a film for all to see, where every bad thing I ever did is like there. That would be just terrifying. I had that fear growing up. It's funny, I had all kinds of different fears growing up. That was one of my fears. I won't reveal to you all of my childhood phobias.
How about over time you reveal all?
The other big one, and I've told this many times, is I was definitely afraid of eternity. I did not want to live forever, and the whole idea scared me. And I've only found a small number of people who have identified with that fear. But the idea of living forever was terrifying to me. It's like I still got that. Well, I used to imagine in my head just this sort of stretching out of time.
Forever is a long time.
That's a long time. And I thought everybody in church talked about it like it was this great thing. And whenever I imagined it, I thought, that doesn't sound great to me at all. That sounds horrible.
The other thing is like flying around in cars and everything.
Don't you guys have Spotify? I mean, but when you're young, at least when I was young, you interpret the mysteries of religion within the framework of your own childish understanding. And it creates, fears and different kinds of things. And so that's what I did. But justification is very important. I want you to understand, Paul, he's going to use three terms, but this first one has to do with, we say, okay, God is righteous. He has fulfilled his promises. He has done what the prophets said that he was going to do. That's Paul's main thesis. He opens up the book with that. But how does that apply to us? Well, the first way it applies is that we stand guilty before the judge. Paul has said that. But God has pardoned us. He has pardoned us, and we can know that now by faith. Now, he doesn't exactly explain just yet how that works. He hasn't gone into the mechanics of how that works, but he's claimed it. God has pardoned it. The second word is redemption, here on page 20. And this word is maybe less like a law court thing. It's almost more economic. So I'll put that there. There's a lot of regulations in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, where you could recover things that you had sold earlier for a set price. So to redeem something is to buy something back. Now, I think the first time this appears might be in the book of Leviticus. And it's just if I want to give a field or an animal or a quantity of money to the temple, I can do that. and then they sort of borrow it for a season of time, but then if at a later date I want that thing back, I can purchase it back. And that's called redemption. So it has this sense of buying back. And that's why I say these three phrases are not three different ways of saying the same thing. Each one builds on the other. If I've been forgiven, well, very well and good. But now there's a transfer of ownership. So it's not just that I've been forgiven, but God has, in a certain sense, purchased me back. I belonged to someone else, whoever that might be, but now I belong to God. And He has purchased me back. I got a lot of scripture passages here. Probably the most famous example all of us know is from the book of Ruth, where Ruth is a Moabite woman, and her husband is dead, and according to the law of Moses, she should be married by her closest kinsman. And in an ancient world where women did not usually have very many rights or the ability to own property, then that's a way of protecting them. And that person is called their kinsman redeemer. So I told Becky on numerous occasions, if we were living under the law of Moses and I died, you'd have to marry Uncle Trav. She just never thought that was very funny. I don't know what that was about. But the point is not that you marrying Becky would not be the way we think of it today as some sort of romantic thing, but it would be a way of protecting my estate, my name, my inheritance. So then if and when she had children, they could carry on the Lewis name. They could inherit our property, and there could be continuity from one generation to the next. So there's an example of redemption in terms of people.
It's a legal mechanism for protection.
It's a legal mechanism for protection, because I'm sure as many of you know, women in the ancient world did not have the kinds of rights and privileges that they have today. These things today are very, very recent in human history. Women in the ancient world either belonged to their father, who cared for them, or their husband, who they were married to. But they weren't sort of freewheeling, independent agents in society the way they have the privilege, the way you could say it's a privilege, you could say it's a right. It's what they do today. They have their own money. They have their own property. They cut their own deals. That didn't happen in the ancient world, and so if a woman lost her husband, if she lost her father, she could be destitute. She'd have no way of making a way forward for herself in the world, except for the most ancient of all female occupations, which would be prostitution. And so this was designed to help them survive if catastrophe should strike. So here, redemption. The Israelites coming up out of Egypt is considered redemption. I'll put that on the board here. Israel leaves Egypt. We know the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. They are liberated from, but also for. They're liberated from bondage to the Egyptians, but they're also liberated for God. And there's a little bit of a difference there between what, the Bible and what today we call liberation theology. The point of God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt is not to just set them free in the wilderness and say, all right, be free, but to purchase them back for Himself. And the book of Exodus says that. I took you out of Egypt from the land of bondage and brought you to myself. So redemption isn't just leaving behind sin, but is now you live life for God. Forgiveness of sin, the idea of justification, and redemption is, I'll even use the word owned. You now belong to God. A redeemed person belongs to another person. Now, in a modern democratic context, this is offensive to a lot of people. But somebody's going to own you. We can't, there's a part of us that is free, but there's a part of us that belongs to someone or something or some power. We're not just wholly 100%. People talk about independence. If you think about it, there's really only one being in the whole universe that is completely independent. God. Nobody else is completely independent. Even people who think that they're financially independent depend on the government to facilitate their job, the laws that regulate the roads and all of the other things that they depend upon. And so there's a lot of loose talk these days about independence, but strictly speaking, independence is God's fare alone. We're all dependent on something. So in redemption, there's this idea of buying back. Now, I'm going to talk about propitiation in a moment, but I want to see if there's anything about justification and redemption there. Taking my time with this one, yeah.
Isn't it kind of in our makeup that we, even though we claim we're free, our makeup doesn't allow it. In other words, if we end up worshiping or we end up bowing down to whether it's money or whether it's career or whether it's, we walk around and we tout that we're free, but it's almost like it's a pretend, or it's like a denial of who we are, because we end up, it's like we're a slave to something and we don't even admit it. Does that make any sense? Or
Yeah, I mean, if I can't say no to a passion, am I free? Now, the passion's in me, so it's not some external force that is enslaving me like a slave master. But if I have passions that I can't say no to, I mean, Paul will use this language, you were enslaved to your passions. You're not really free.
it's like an illusion.
Well, in America, we talk about freedom almost entirely in political terms. So freedom is almost spoken entirely of some external oppressive force that prevents you from doing what you want to do. That's some of what freedom is, but it's not the whole story. Many people are enslaved to their passions, their self-love, hatred of other people, other things that boil up inside of them, and basically run them and control them. And in that sense, that is inner freedom. And,
Like the last book that we studied, he kind of made the point that
yeah.
even though that they were severely oppressed, they still had freedom to choose how they were going to act. If they were going to act in a kind way towards the people, or if they were going to be one of the, hard-nosed, sellouts that, so there's a certain amount of freedom or choosing
Yeah.
what you were going to be owned by or slave.
Yeah, I think Frankl said even in a concentration camp where almost everything that we would call freedom was taken away from them, there was still a residuum of freedom to choose what their attitude would be. And as we saw, some people in the concentration camp became very, very wicked people. And then others of them chose a different attitude. And Frankl doesn't really try to explain the people who made one choice or the people who made the other choice. I just think he wants the people reading the book to know that there is a choice, that there is freedom, and that you're never just entirely deprived of it. And then in some of the later chapters, he's really just tottering on the edge of Christianity, talking about how God's grace enables the free choices that we have. Because he does realize that we're not just, we don't just have power as individual people to do whatever we want. But he does say that choice is there. So the meaning of the word freedom here is pretty important. But these three words, and we're going to talk about propitiation here, are very important to Paul. Propitiation is sacrificial. So now we have to go to kind of ancient Judaism and the temple and the way they ran the sacrificial system. So this is justification is a legal, forensic term. Redemption is an economic term, and propitiation is a sacrificial term. Literally, propitiation means to turn the face. There's a lot of discussion about how to interpret this. But the idea is that of substitution. When you sacrifice an animal, there are two elements of the animal's life. They're not philosophers back here. If you take a goat up and you cut its throat, there's going to be a warm gush of blood. And the blood is going to be part of the sacrificial ritual. If you know a little bit about the Old Testament, they'll cut the animal's throat, they'll catch the blood from the throat in a bowl, and then they'll perform various rituals with it. Those rituals with the blood are often called kippur. That's a Hebrew word. It's often translated atonement. Sometimes it's translated ransom. One life for another, though, is the idea. So if we say a person has been ransomed, we say they've been bought back. But if there's a buying, there's a transaction. If I go to the store and I buy something, I give them money, they give me a bicycle. There's got to be some medium of transaction, some currency, and blood is the currency. Well, that's a question beyond my competency. What I can tell you, I do a little bit with history, is that the sacrificial system precedes anything in the Bible by thousands of years. In other words, it's not like Moses instituted sacrifice and the Israelites said, "Oh, we never heard of this before." However, if you read different cultures, they all perform sacrifices, but they have different ideas of what it is they think that they're doing. So what I would say to that is Yahweh takes over in the nation of Israel an already existing ritual that seems as old as the human race itself. And to use a Bill O'Reilly term, spins it in his own way. This is Yahweh's spin on what sacrifice means.
The sacrificial system started in the garden, just after the garden, Cain and Abel.
Right.
I mean, there was
It's way back. So, he's talking about Genesis. If you read Adam and Eve disobeying and eating the fruit, in the very next chapter, Cain and Abel are bringing sacrifices. And then there's the passage that he clothed the man and the woman with animal skins after they realized that they were naked. So, man, if there were about 4 or 5 more verses in that part of the Bible, it would spell a lot of things out. But the Bible is kind of herky-jerky. Adam and Eve fall, they realize they're naked, Yahweh clothes them with animal skins. We couldn't do that unless an animal was slaughtered. And then in the very next passage, Cain and Abel are bringing sacrifice. So, what's that? Yeah, offerings. Cain is bringing vegetable offerings from his agricultural produce, and Abel is bringing flocks. But there's no real spelling out of exactly what happened there in that remote eon of human prehistory. But you're right, it's mentioned, it goes way, way back, way before the time of Moses. The two things you get out of a sacrifice are blood and flesh. Now, the flesh is food. We tend to forget that when we visit the Meijer and we see it all packaged in styrofoam. But, you know, these animals were killed. This is where the meat comes from. So you could say that the blood provides a ransom for the old life. But food, if you think about it, is not to ransom the old life, it's for new life. New life. New life. Because when you eat the flesh, the life of that animal becomes part of your life, and it sustains you. Whether it's a burger or a steak or ribs or whatever it is. Yeah.
I find it interesting that the blood and the flesh are the two things that Jesus says in the communion. This is my body, this is my blood.
You should find that interesting. We're actually going to have communion today. If you look over at the altar there, we've got the wine, or the grape juice, whatever you want to call it. That's the blood. And Jesus says that at the Last Supper. It is poured out for the forgiveness of sin. And then the flesh. This is my body, which is for you. So this imagery carries over into the communion ceremony. The idea is that Christ, that's another way of describing what Christ does for us. He forgives our sin, yes, but he also gives us new life. It's not just about getting rid of the old life, it's about new life. And the new life sustains us for a different kind of life moving forward than the old life that we're putting behind us. So I think that these three ways that Paul uses here are building one upon the other toward a very tightly woven idea of how he understands the righteousness of God. How does that apply to people? And propitiation is a sacrificial term. He's gonna focus on that. That's a very important distinction to draw because a lot of times, especially in Protestant circles, we think that the sacrificial system of the Old Testament was all about sin. It wasn't all about sin. In fact, most of the offerings that you would bring throughout the course of a year would be even if you hadn't done anything wrong. A big part of the sacrificial system is to provide food, meat. And we know that every time we go shopping. We just don't make the act of taking an animal life and then eating it very solemn. But in ancient Israel, that was a very, very solemn thing. And you might have heard that in primitive communities, sometimes they even apologize to their prey when they kill it, because there's a heightened awareness of the fact that this deer or this cow or this chicken has died in order that I might live. So those are the three big words. So I spent most of the class on that, but I want to stop and see if there's any questions, because what Paul's going to do now He's going to go a number of different directions with that. Did that work? Yeah, I glossed over that last week, and I said, well, I do have to go over that because we all present the gospel in different ways to different people at different times. But of course, in Romans, we want to know, how does Paul present it? How does he understand it? What's the language that he uses? And Christians have gravitated toward all three of these. But I think all three of them are mutually reinforcing. They have to be kept together. Chapter 4, verse 1. Paul now will get a little bit of foot in the door on this, and this will carry us into next week. Paul wants to talk about Abraham because Abraham is really the first Yahweh worshiper in the Bible. And we know that Abraham lived in Mesopotamia, probably around 2000 BC. We know that he and his ancestors worshipped other gods. The Bible's very clear about that. Our ancestors worshipped other gods. But at some point, Abraham becomes a worshiper of Yahweh. We don't know how. The Bible just says Yahweh said to Abraham. And then you're off to the races with the story. But for Paul, this is important because the Jews in his time are making a big deal about circumcision. They're saying that anybody who comes to Christ has to be circumcised because that goes back to Abraham. And once they're circumcised, that's the first in a series of other rituals that they also have to observe because otherwise they're not faithful Jews. So in chapter 4, verse 1, I'm just going to read this out of the ESV, and then we'll pick this up on page 23. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham our forefather according to the flesh? That's an important phrase, according to the flesh. He means those of us Jews who are physically descended from Abraham. But if Paul says there are some people who are physically descended from Abraham, he's already suggested that there are also what? People who are spiritually descended from Abraham. So he's being very sneaky here. If Abraham was justified, there's our word, by works, some outward ritual, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? And here he goes. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So, we might ask, okay, the judge has pardoned somebody. What is the basis of that pardon? Paul wants to say it's not because Abraham was circumcised, it's because he trusted God. That was the basis of his pardon. So he's going to set up this duality between faith and works. Now, to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. So when Paul says works, he connects the word works with merit. Now, I won't say every time he uses the word works he does that, but in this passage he does. And merit means someone owes you something. So Paul wants to say if you do works in the sense of which I'm speaking, God owes you something. But on the other hand, then he says, to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted to him as righteousness. So faith, unlike works, does not merit, but I'll just make this up off the top of my head, begs for grace. Basically, you're putting everything on your superior. You're saying, have mercy upon me. Be gracious. I'm not worthy of it, but please. I wrote a fill-in-the-blank test a few years ago. There's a big essay at the end of it, and they had A, B, C, and D, and I remember writing under D, I have no idea what this question is about, and I throw myself on the mercy of my teacher. And a great many students circled that. And then I did it kind of as a joke, but then I had kind of a moral problem after I went home, and I said, oh, geez, I made this open to them. Am I going to, shall they be forgiven? I had this scandal of grace that confronted me. I won't tell you what I did. It differed from student to student. David also speaks of the blessing of the one whom God counts righteousness apart from works. So now Paul wants to get into the idea that there are two kinds of righteousness. There's a righteousness that you earn through your own merit, and there's a righteousness in the sense of acquittal that God gives you even when you don't merit it. And this is a bad example. Yeah.
But chapter 3, none is righteous, no, not one.
Right. And so in chapter 3, he's already said the first kind of righteousness, the one that's meritorious, we're all kind of zeroed out. Maybe this person has more, this person has less, but it's not sufficient to avoid condemnation. Everybody before God stands damnable. And so you're quite right about that. Maybe somebody will want to say, well, let's start counting points. And I think Paul has already established that's not going to work. Because that would be like me looking down at two worms having an argument about who is the stronger. It zeroes out at that point. Maybe one is comparatively stronger than the other, but not before me, and I'm the judge. And so the idea is that meritorious works, no one will be saved on the basis of meritorious works. Now, I say that because this word works is a little slippery. It gets used at different times in different ways in the Bible, and so we have to be cautious of it. There's a famous passage in John where the Pharisees ask Jesus, what are the works that we must do? And Jesus says, to believe in the Son. So he pulls the old switcheroo on them there. And so there the word works is being referred to, say, the act of putting your trust. Well, that's fine. But in this particular context, Paul's talking about merit, because he says a man who works earns what he gets. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. And he quotes Psalm 32. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. Now that's interesting from a number of angles, but one is how often Paul draws from the Old Testament this language of grace. Because a lot of times, I'll have to talk about this in England. I just got an email today, because I'm going to be going to England, not next week. I'll be here next week, but the week after. And the teacher said she's got a number of students who think that the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament. And then they want me to have a Q&A with the students. Because the perception is that the God of the Old Testament is a kind of ogre, who's all about works, and then the God of the New Testament is a nice guy. And so that's probably going to come up. Verse 7 and 8 in chapter 4, though, You're all biblically literate people. Doesn't the Old Testament, it's just filled with talk of God's grace. It's not that Yahweh was an ungracious God. I mean, blessed is he whose sins are not counted against him, whom Yahweh acquits and justifies. Verse 9, is this blessing only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? And here's Paul's main point. Was it counted before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the uncircumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So Paul wants to point out, and if we actually zip back to the book of Genesis, the passage in question is Genesis chapter 15. There's 3 chapters, 15, 16, and 17, that deal with God's command for him to circumcise his offspring. But in chapter 15, it contains a famous story where Abraham doesn't have any kids. Yahweh takes him out and has him look up at the stars and says, count the stars if you can count them. So shall your offspring be. And then chapter 15, verse 6 says, he believed Yahweh, and Yahweh counted it to him as righteousness. Now that's important for Paul because the command to circumcise hasn't happened yet. Because you can't circumcise kids unless you have kids. So what necessarily precedes that is the belief or the faith that Yahweh will fulfill his promise. And Abraham does that. So for Paul, many Jews are pointing back to the circumcision and saying, oh, this goes way, way back. And Paul says, I could make it worse for you. Let's take it even a little further back. Abraham trusted the Lord. And so Paul wants to say that faith or trust is the fundamental basis of religious life. It's all about trust. Rituals come later, and they seal the trust. And you could say the same thing with Christians in baptism. Or I could say the same thing with marriage and vows at the altar. Presumably, by the time the husband and wife get to the altar, they've made up their mind. Unless it's Hollywood and it's the runaway bride scenario. But for the most part, and in the same way, probably around Easter, AJ's not here right now, so I won't embarrass him. I'll baptize AJ. If I ask him, do you believe in God the Father? He's thought about this. So this outward ritual is, it's already settled. He's just doing it in the presence of witnesses. He's given his thought to this. Or at least he's supposed to. Supposed to. Let me stop and see if there's any question or comment or discussion, because this is a big issue, and I don't want to press too much far forward to this before next week.
Do you know, is it known when the book of James was written? Was it after Romans?
Pretty sure.
It almost seems like a circular thing, like they believe this, what Paul's arguing here, too much and kind of went off the rails. And James kind of brings them back to, well, wait a minute, you can't drop off half of the story.
Yeah. Well, I think, so many of you know that the book of James throws a spoke into this wheel that we're on right now. Let me just read the passage from James. If you have your Bibles, James uses the language of faith and works, and in his letter, he challenges, at least ostensibly, apparently, James chapter 2, verse 14. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can that faith save him? Key word there is that. If he says he has faith, okay, so you say, but then there are no works to back it up. And then James says, can faith of that sort save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, be warm and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead.
So he's just really completing the circle. I mean, Paul's arguing
Yeah.
one way, but it seems interesting if James was written substantially after this, that maybe like the Christian community had kind of gone off the rails and started going, oh, well, I have faith. It doesn't matter what I do.
Right, so
And James is arguing back on, whoa.
they've grabbed hold of a formula. You know, as soon as you give people a formula, then they run with it. And then they think that they're in the clear. And James is saying, hey, hang on. Because I think what James would say, faith that doesn't produce works, basically what he's saying is it's not real faith. You can call it that if you want. But if it's real faith, then it's going to issue forth in charitable works. Because Paul here is concerned about carts and horses. He thinks that faith is what generates good works. And he's right about that. But then you can see how later down the road people are going to say, oh, well, all you got to have is faith. And so I guess as long as I sign my name to the creed and do the 12 steps to salvation, I'm in the clear. It's like, not exactly. So there's an example, because I showed earlier how Jesus uses the word works to actually refer to faith. So one trick is that you can't just pluck a word out of the Bible and expect it to work for every place where that word appears in the Bible. Different writers are going to use different words in different ways. Absolutely they are. That's a good question, though. But that passage did scandalize Martin Luther because it just runs so directly against, it so directly confronts this passage that we're talking about in Paul. But I think it's a trivial distinction. I think
they complement each other, right?
Yeah.
It's like the whole story, not half of the story.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I don't know, Pastor Chad.
You're not sure? You want to kick James out of the canon?
Well, the book of James is a right strawy epistle.
That's what Luther said. He said it's a right strawy epistle. But I like the book of James, the letter to James.
Martin Luther called it a right strawy epistle. I was trying to show how clever I am. And failing miserably at it.
Everything depends on the word merit. Everything depends on the word merit. No one can merit salvation. I think Christians know that. We can't earn it. We can't get up to the judgment day and say, all right, Lord, I'm here. I think you owe me a few things. If that's you, let me know. I want to watch that exchange. All right, Lord. Maybe even worse, give me what I deserve. Don't say that. Yeah, because he might actually, and then you'll really be in trouble, right? Give me what I got coming to me. So we all know it's like, no, you can't approach the Lord with that attitude. But James does want to say, look, if you are the recipient of God's grace, you're going to do good works. Because that's the evidence of the reality of faith operating in you. So one goes with the other. I got to let you go. We'll meet you downstairs. Thank you very much. And the title of today's lesson, Trav is not here, is